how it is.
Okay. Well, hello from my basement. So as she said, I'm Patrick Miller. I'm an associate professor of political science at KU. I'm from Virginia originally, interesting for redistricting. I've lived in a lot of redistricting interesting states: North Carolina, Georgia, Ohio. Kansas might be the least interesting on the redistricting list of places I have lived, but we have the potential for a very interesting one in this upcoming set of drawing the lines. But I've been at KU since 2013. I mostly study American political behavior, a lot of political psychology and elections. And I like electoral maps. So redistricting is kind of one of my favorite topics. That said, I mean, this is a very interesting topic. It is a topic where everything, the politics of it is changing very rapidly, from what's going on in partisan politics to what's going on in our courts. So I hope to address a lot of that with you today. Let me go ahead and share my screen, since I do have a PowerPoint, and then put this over on, here we go. All right. So I want to talk to you about how redistricting works first. It's a very, in many ways, a similar process throughout the country. Each state does have its own unique quirks. So I want to put this in a broader context and then talk a little bit more about Kansas, and then some of the issues that are really affecting the politics of redistricting right now. So if we think about redistricting, the place where you start is numbers, number of seats, and how you determine how that cuts across population. So, you know, this crowd, very informed about politics. So you all know we have 40 seats in our state Senate, 125 in our state House. The US Senate is set at 2 seats by the Constitution. The US House decides for itself how many seats that it wants to be, though every state is guaranteed at least 1 seat. Currently, it sets itself at 435 seats. It could be more if it wanted. And there is a formula for determining how many seats each state gets. It's called the equal proportions method, which you see here, where you basically pipe in census numbers, and each state gets what's called a priority number to allocate the number of seats over the one that is guaranteed. So states get those seats until you run out of seats to be apportioned or given out. In our state legislature, it's a little simpler, where everything is strictly done by population. So a Kansas State House seat right now is roughly about 23,000 people, for example, and you're cutting the population up approximately proportionally to meet that equal division. And all of this is based on census numbers, which is why, you know, the quality of the census count, which is arguably quite questionable, what was done in 2020, that's going to be incredibly important, because there are real consequences to that for allocating representation, as well as, you know, federal formulas, federal funding, and so forth. So if we look at the apportionment process, this changes every 10 years. So unlike the US Senate, for example, where every state always gets 2 seats, if we come back to that apportioning method, over time, different states gain or lose representation. So you can see here, for example, the last apportionment from 2010, and states that gained in blue, which are generally Western and Southern states, Sunbelt states, and states that lost in orange. Generally, recently, that has been the Deep South, the Plains, the Midwest, and New England. By all projections, this is going to continue, this trend, in the next reapportionment. We won't have those official numbers until now August. It's been pushed back because of quality checks on the census. But, you know, the states that are going to be gaining representation are states like Colorado, Oregon, Texas, Florida, North Carolina. States that will be losing will be places like West Virginia, Rhode Island, Alabama, New York, Illinois. These regional trends are continuing based on population growth. Kansas, we last lost a seat in 1990. Since then, most of our neighbors, except for Colorado, which has gained representation, most of our neighbors have lost representation. We are inching towards losing our 4th congressional district. I don't think that it's going to happen to us in.
Patrick, sorry, I muted you. I muted everybody. So unmute yourself. Sorry about that. Should have said it before I did it. I apologize.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. What's the last thing you heard?
About how we might lose our luck.
Okay, yeah. All right, so Kansas, yeah, we're inching towards losing our 4th congressional district. I think it's more likely in 2030. Much like, you know, every state in our region except for Colorado, our population growth has been relatively flat, and flat is not good enough to keep the representation that you have when you have states like Virginia, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, just gaining hundreds of thousands of people every year, every few years. So they're going to gain at our expense. When states are allocated these seats, there are general redistricting standards. I don't know why I have a random comment there. And these vary by federal versus state. So are you drawing a federal map for Congress or a state map for state legislature? And I want to say that very few of these are actually strict requirements. They are generally considered guidelines that can and typically are violated much of the time. So we should go through these, you know, I'll go through these quickly to talk about what generally is happening here. Equal population is one standard. At the federal level for Congress, that is strictly enforced. Federal courts, for example, have struck down congressional district maps for a deviation as few as 4 people. Whereas in state legislatures, and that means, you know, one district had 4 more people than another district. State legislatures, the courts are generally a little more tolerant. Deviations under 10% are constitutional in federal courts, and over 10% might be allowed in certain cases, such as, for example, if you're trying to draw a district to enable the election of Native Americans, and if you make that district bigger to meet a standard size, you're actually diluting the Native American vote. That might be a rationale for having a district that is underpopulated. Kansas guidelines tolerate a 5% population deviation from the target population. Contiguity, meaning all parts of the district have to be connected. You can't have a district that's Douglas County and then Riley County with nothing connecting them, for example. That is strictly enforced in both federal and state maps. Water counts as contiguity though. Even if there's not a bridge connecting land across the water, that counts as contiguity. Touch point contiguity can also count, where 2 districts literally touch a point. Compactness is another standard that is often generally ignored, particularly for federal maps, but has sometimes been used for evidence of a race-based gerrymander. There really is no requirement for districts to be compact. We'll talk about that a little more because I think people are very attracted to that standard. States have different rules based on this. Kansas, we have compactness rules, but they're not requirements. Communities of interest are generally left to states and map makers to define what those are. It's a standard that's not really a standard in many ways. Political boundaries, meaning county or city lines, are generally ignored in federal maps. Different states have different requirements about respecting those. We have that guideline in Kansas, for example, but again, it's often broken. Incumbents, do you protect incumbents or not? Generally ignored in federal maps, sometimes not. Different states have different requirements about protecting incumbent legislators. Partisanship and race have really been where there's been a lot of court action around this. Due to a recent Supreme Court ruling, the federal courts can't rule on partisan gerrymandering anymore, which means that states are free to gerrymander, at least at the federal level, congressional districts as much as they please based on partisanship, and can, in theory, do whatever they want. As long as districts are contiguous and equal population, can do whatever they want in terms of drawing a congressional map, if they can say they did it on partisan grounds. Different states, again, have different requirements. Race also has a very complex legal history. And I would be misrepresenting it to say that the federal courts even have an acceptable standard that is universally agreed on with race and redistricting. We're kind of at a point now where race can be a factor, but not the factor in drawing districts at both the state or the federal level. What happens with that in this next round of redistricting will be very interesting. Some districts, their existence is protected by the Voting Rights Act. That could possibly be undone in this next couple of court sessions, with some substantial impacts on how diverse representation is at the federal and the state level. So a lot of different standards here. Partisanship, race, pretty key, and only really contiguity and equal population are strictly enforced. We do have standards in Kansas. If we look to the 2010 redistricting guidelines, we see a number of standards that are supposed to be followed, like equal population within the accepted deviation, not diluting minority voting rights, using precincts to build districts, compactness, contiguity, respecting political subdivisions, similarities of interest of communities, avoiding contests between incumbents, and districts that make sense. At our congressional level in Kansas, we do have some guidelines: equal population, preserving the core of existing districts, and avoiding county splits. However, I would say to you that all of these are just guidelines. None of them are requirements. And if we look at historical maps in Kansas, these guidelines have often been ignored. And we are now at a point now where, thanks to federal court rulings on partisanship, claiming that you drew a district based on party trumps every other consideration except for contiguity and equal population. So very few of these guidelines are musts. And I think that's an important thing to understand for people who are watching the process, is that a guideline is not a requirement. It is more of a suggestion that can be ignored politically when you would like to do that. When guidelines are violated, the courts are the only remedy for resolving that, which typically involves a drawn out process. And also, quite frankly, with the politics of our courts as the way they are, courts are increasingly backing away from ruling on redistricting and going in a direction that redistricting reform advocates, quite frankly, don't like. And there are important distinctions between the federal and state courts on this. There have been more rollbacks on redistricting reform at the federal level than there have been at the state level. So for example, in Kansas, there could be a way into state courts to strike down any gerrymander of the state based on whatever partisanship claims, through the state courts, but not through the federal courts anymore. As you're watching this again, what in the next few years I think is really key to look at is what the courts are saying about race. And we can talk about that a bit later if you want. Another area where there are a lot of cases being adjudicated right now is effectively who counts, one person, one vote. Bluntly, conservatives are in court with a number of cases that are trying to limit who actually counts for drawing of districts. So the Supreme Court has heard or will be hearing cases that look at, for example, not counting non-citizens, not counting minors, even if they are citizens. So your children would not count for apportioning districts because they are not eligible voters. There has also been a case that is looking at only counting people who vote for allocating districts. So far, even the most conservative courts have not budged on this. But if we look at some of the more recent rulings, there have been some suggestions that they could be open to looking at this in future sessions. So, conservative judges have put out a signal that we could be seeing some change in the one person, one vote standards that we have. So that's another thing to be watching going forward. So in practice, I think it's important to realize that with our system as it is, politicians can likely redistrict however they want, as long as they respect the population equality and contiguity rules. An interesting thing about Kansas, many Kansas counties are also pretty ripe for lawsuits. We often forget that county commission districts and city city council districts, city commission districts, wards, those get redistricted as well. And they often get little scrutiny, but there are some areas of concern. One thing I've noticed, Douglas County doesn't have this issue, but there are a number of counties in Kansas where their county commission districts are not contiguous. And typically, and I have no idea how they get away with it. I've asked, it shocks everyone. But a typical thing would be, let's say you have a county, Lyon County, where Emporia does this, for example. I believe it's one of the counties. A typical thing might be have a part of the main city in a district paired with a part of the rural part of the county. And those two parts of the district don't touch, but they are one county commission district. And I've noticed we've had a number of counties that do this. So I would not be surprised if we began to see some lawsuits about this in Kansas in particular. One side effect of this, with important consequences in Kansas, particularly in some of our more diverse communities, is that by breaking cities apart in that manner, you're also diluting the ability of minority populations to elect a minority person to a county commission. So for example, some of our majority Hispanic counties in Southwest Kansas, where the population is majority Hispanic, but the electorate, the voting age citizen electorate is actually still majority white. What they do is they break apart the majority Hispanic urban center of the county and they pair it with a much wider rural part of the county, so that a county that, even though the minority of voters are Hispanic, if you drew them together, they might be able to elect a Latino, a Hispanic county commission member. They can't do that because that population is what we call cracked apart geographically. So this could be an area where I think we might see some legal action in Kansas. But yeah, people often forget that redistricting also happens at the local level as well. Those districts are not, they're not constants. The general process in Kansas for federal maps is that both houses of the legislature pass the maps, the governor signs it. For state maps in Kansas, the legislature and the governor agree. In Missouri, there is a bipartisan legislative commission for each chamber. Currently in Kansas, we do not have a gerrymandered map. Back in 2010, the nicest way to put this is that moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans were both trying to shaft each other on the redistricting process. And as a result, they could not come to an agreement on new maps. And so ultimately the courts ended up drawing those maps. And so for the last decade in Kansas, we've had maps that generally are compact. They keep cities and counties together. They follow the redistricting guidelines pretty strictly. It allows some competition, but it's also preserved Republican majorities in both our congressional and legislative delegation. Missouri, the federal maps are gerrymandered. They're on partisan grounds. And counties are generally free to redistrict themselves internally, however they see fit. So I want to show you some maps and talk about some of the issues, and watching my time here as well. So you're probably familiar with the current Kansas congressional map as it is. Even if we keep 4 districts, there's going to have to be some changes with this. The 3rd district, for example, has too many people because of Johnson County's growth. It will need to lose population. The 1st and the 2nd are the most underpopulated. They will definitely have to expand. The 4th is about almost where it needs to be. It'll have to change a little. But just on population grounds, we'll have to have a little bit of adjustment. Although, of course, politically, there is the potential for a major redraw of the maps. So just for fun, I drew using 2016 numbers because those were easiest for me to use. Just some examples here to get you thinking about different ways that Kansas could be drawn. So on the upper left, for example, you have a map that is something similar to what Republicans had originally proposed 10 years ago, where 10 years ago, Republicans had a little bit of a different challenge. Their challenge was neutralizing Wyandotte and Douglas counties. But right now, Johnson County voters have become a problem for Republicans. They become a lot more Democratic, and Johnson County by itself is over 80% of the congressional district. So figuring out what to do with Johnson County is going to be a challenge for people in Topeka. But 10 years ago, Johnson County was much more Republican. And so one of the proposals to basically break up the 3rd district and make sure it wasn't a competitive district anymore would have put Johnson County in a district that ran down to the Oklahoma border. Douglas County would have been put into a county that ran out to southwest Kansas. And if in this kind of map, Trump would have won every district by at least 11%, Sharice Davids, would likely be defeated in this kind of map. You could alternatively have a map like what you see on the upper right, whose goal is to create the most racially diverse district possible. And that would be the green map, which, even though it's the most minority heavy district, the electorate's a lot wider than the population is, and that would still be a safely Republican district. The purple district there would be more competitive. And for the Democrats in the crowd, you can, in fact, draw 2 congressional districts that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. And in fact, on the bottom right, one of them's not too ugly. It just takes Wichita out of Sedgwick County and puts it in basically an I-35 district. Though, for Democrats, that's not going to happen. Sorry. One of the things that I would suggest you be looking at in this next round of reapportionment, and this will have a big impact on us here in Douglas County because we're sitting next to Johnson County, is again the question of what to do with Johnson County. So again, Johnson County has become much more Democratic, and it is most of a congressional district. If you keep Johnson County intact with its growth rates and how much it's bluer it's getting, you can't really draw a very comfortably Republican district. So some of the chatter that we've been hearing has been about breaking Johnson County up into 2 or 3 parts and then drawing each part out into rural Kansas. So effectively, the way you would neutralize Johnson County is cut it up and drown it out with red rural Kansas. And that would be legal. The legislature can do that if it wants. There is no hard and fast rule about keeping Johnson County together just because it's large or the most populous. And I think there's a very real possibility that we could see the county broken up in some way, much like Jackson County is on the Missouri side, which is very similar in that it could be most of a congressional district by itself, but it's split into 2 districts for gerrymandering purposes. So I would keep your eye on this. And for us, again, that will have some consequences. Pretty much any way you would draw a map involves drawing the counties westward. So here in Douglas County, we could find ourselves in a district going out to western Kansas, southwest, possibly the Colorado border. I think that's a very real possibility. And Missouri, just because it's next door, could also see substantial changes. Republicans will definitely have to shore up the 2nd district. It voted for Donald Trump over Joe Biden by 1/10 of a point. And Ann Wagner's been having some trouble getting reelected in that district, so they'll need to change those boundaries to protect her. I also think there's a real possibility that Emanuel Cleaver will be eliminated in redistricting. Jackson County could be split up between 2 or 3 districts, and that's been being discussed. Again, each chunk drawn out far into rural Missouri. So both of the Democrats in the congressional delegations in the Kansas City Metro it's a very real possibility that neither of them will be in Congress after 2022. So I wanted to leave you with some general points that hit at some of the things that are often getting talked about with redistricting reform, some blunt politics on this. First, this process is inherently political, and you cannot make it non-political. I kind of cringe at the suggestion that redistricting can somehow be made non-political, because even something as simple as defining what is fair is a political choice. You are picking winners and you are picking losers. And that is an inherently political process. Now, you can make the process less partisan. I absolutely agree with that, but you cannot make it non-political. So I think that's something we fundamentally have to realize. Another blunt reality is that in Kansas and elsewhere, rural communities are going to be losing representation. Kansas is a mostly urban state. We don't look like it on a map, but half of our population fits in 4 counties. And about 75% of Kansans live in just 19 counties. So this is what you see on the left is census projections from the first part of the decade, where basically the main population growth in the state is in your more urban centers. So places like Douglas County and Johnson and the Manhattan area and Wichita will be gaining population, have been gaining population. And so therefore they'll gain more representation in our state legislature. Whereas the mass of rural Kansas that has been stagnant or losing population will be losing representation. So for example, if you look at Southeast Kansas with the population losses there, if you add that up by counties, it about comes out to 1 state Senate district. So the lines will have to be moved a little bit, but Southeast Kansas, for example, will probably lose 1 state Senate district that's going to have to come up to the Kansas City Metro, for example, just given our population growth here. And we're going to see that kind of change throughout the state, just bluntly because of equal population. I also want to point out that clean and compact does not necessarily equal fair, and especially when we're talking about race. So let me use Louisiana as a good example in watching my time here. Louisiana is a state that is 1/3 African-American. Trump won it 58-39 over Clinton, very similar margin over Biden. It is a state with an intense and long history of overt discrimination against African Americans in every aspect of voting, from voter registration to drawing of district lines, and where it is a state that was covered by Section 5 preclearance of the Voting Rights Act up until the point where the Supreme Court gutted that, because Congress decided that a state like Louisiana needed a check on it and how it treated racial minorities in the political process. So, one thing that people often advocate in redistricting reform is districts that are clean and compact and that look pretty. And I think there is a very sexy appeal in the redistricting reform community of districts that look nice and make sense, as if that is somehow yielding a better outcome. But I think what that does is it often ignores the reality of why ugly lines might exist. So think about Louisiana, 1/3 African American. The map on the left is not compact, it is not clean, it is not pretty. But what this map does is it accomplishes the guaranteed election of 2 African Americans, Democrats, to Congress, 3 white Republicans, and creates 1 swing district that either party could win. So think about that, right? In a state that has 6 congressional districts, the ugly map on the left is guaranteeing proportional representation of African Americans in the congressional delegation, and it's making sure that at least 1 district is competitive. Right now, Louisiana has 0 competitive congressional districts. There's no real choice in Louisiana elections. It also only has 1 Black member of Congress. So that map accomplishes both competition and diverse representation, Whereas the clean and compact and sexy and attractive map on the right, no competitive districts, and it eliminates every African American from the Louisiana congressional delegation, and by de facto eliminates every Democrat. So in a state, you think about the partisan implications, where about 40% of the population votes Democratic typically, they get no representation in Congress with that. Likewise, ugly districts can often serve a purpose. Ugly districts can serve, obviously, competitive, creating competition. Sometimes to make districts competitive, you have to make them look unattractive. Putting communities together that are adjacent to one another is more likely to put homogeneous communities together and actually eliminate competition in many ways. But I think one thing I often see left out of discussions about ugly districts is the fact that, bluntly, most ugly districts are created to allow the election of minorities. And so some very famous examples here. So this is Illinois' 4th congressional district on the left. This is a district that is, often derided for its shape, but it does something very important. It unites 2 clusters of Latinos who live in Chicago, and they don't live next to one another. One leans more Puerto Rican, Central American, one area leans more Mexican, and it puts them into a district that is majority Hispanic. And since 1992, it has allowed the election of a Hispanic member of Congress from Illinois. That chunk in between those 2 clusters is mostly African American and mostly white. If you drew this district to be sexy, clean, compact, look nice, you would accomplish that goal, but you would likely eliminate all Hispanic representation in the Illinois congressional delegation. Likewise, over on the right, some of the most ugly districts that have been created in recent redistricting rounds were created to unite African American populations that didn't live next to each other into a district that was Black enough to send an African American to Congress. And in fact, oftentimes in these states, the first Black members sent to Congress since Reconstruction. These maps accomplish that purpose. If you drew them to be sexy, clean, compact, you likely eliminate African American representation from many congressional delegations and just elect more white people, quite frankly. So that is an aspect of ugly districts that is often really overlooked. And I think let's bluntly talk about the politics of this, because the reality of redistricting reform is that it is hyper-partisan. That's unfortunate. One thing I often don't tell people, I actually would like to get rid of all districts. I think there is a lot of evidence that geography-based representation is not really how legislators go about representing or doing their job in many ways. I mean, they talk like that, they act like it, and of course they represent a certain geographical area. But there's a lot of evidence that over time, members of Congress are increasingly just acting on party agendas and voting on party positions, even when those don't necessarily aid the key interest in their districts. But yet we still have a system of representation that's tied to geography rather than what most democracies do, which is just voting for a party. However, I don't have the magic wand to eliminate all districts. It will be an interesting experiment. But the blunt reality is that it is hyper-partisan. Democrats are generally the ones advocating redistricting reform. And in fact, they have unilaterally disarmed in a number of states with nonpartisan redistricting that in quite bluntly in those states is going to aid Republicans. So Oregon, great example. Oregon has nonpartisan redistricting. Oregon's going to gain a congressional district. If Democrats had retained the ability to gerrymander, they could create that new district to send a Democrat to Congress. But with the commission as it is, that district's probably going to send a Republican who's not going to favor these redistricting reforms, for example. Consequently, because Republicans have not unilaterally disarmed in this way, in fact, they've expanded their ability to gerrymander, they may be able to draw themselves a durable and possibly permanent House majority in 2022, just based on redistricting alone, which would effectively also kill, because how partisan this is, kill any hope of real redistricting reform, both at the federal and the state level. And in fact, in a number of states, as we said, I said Republicans are actually rolling back redistricting reforms. Iowa's a good example right now where Republicans are quite likely to eliminate the nonpartisan redistricting commission and turn it back to the legislature. Missouri, with the repeal of the Clean Missouri initiative, is another example as well. And so, I mean, Democrats are spending a lot of, for the Democrats in the audience, y'all are spending a lot of time talking about reforms like abolishing the Electoral College, abolishing the Senate, that just aren't going to happen. Those are fantasies. Let's be politically real about that. And quite frankly, you're giving your power away by getting rid of your ability to gerrymander, with the ultimate outcome being that a lot of these reforms you'd like to see will have no hope because you reformed redistricting. And so, Democrats, rather than really learning to compete within the system as it is, are somewhat surrendering in that way. Again, this is unfortunately, it's a very partisan topic, and this has real partisan consequences. So that is the end of my slideshow on this, which got me at 35 minutes, just about was my goal, and plenty of time for questions. I'm sure I might have ticked a person or two off. So we can get spicy here.
So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask.
I'll jump in here, Patrick. What do you anticipate that the Republicans in the Kansas legislature are going to be split enough this year that it might result in the same kind of standoff that it did 10 years ago?
No. There are not enough moderate Republicans to really create that dynamic. The one thing that I think might get in the way, so Republicans have been able to retain their supermajority in the legislature. They do have the ability, if they are unified and pass a gerrymander, they can pass that into law over Governor Kelly's veto. But the key is they have to be unified. They can't afford a lot of defections. Right. So whatever few, and there are very few, whatever few moderate Republicans are left, they're going to have on board with this, which I think might entail keeping some of their districts intact instead of, some of the moderate Republicans in rural Kansas, that they could be shafted if you break their districts apart, and not that you're giving them more or less, partisan different districts, you're just giving them new voters. They might be in a position where they sign on to a gerrymander to keep their own districts intact. And obviously with something like breaking Johnson County apart, you're going to have Johnson County Republicans on board with that. Now they're all conservatives. There are no moderate Republicans in the Johnson County delegation. So those kind of moderate conservative tensions aren't going to be there. But they do have the power, but they do need to keep themselves unified.
So Patrick, I was wondering your thoughts about, bullet number 2 on the people-powered Fair Maps campaign that the League of Women Voters US is currently working on for independent redistricting commissions. Am I correct in thinking that you're thinking that's a goal that might not be a good idea?
I think that, well, one, I would rather have an independent redistricting commission than a legislature draw its own lines. So you do accomplish the process, the goal of making it less partisan, although it can still be a partisan process who goes on to these commissions, because typically they're often still chosen by party leaders. And so therefore you have to create some kind of decision-making mechanism where you force a supermajority, for example, to get a map, or if not, have the courts as a backup. Where I would probably disagree with a lot of redistricting reform advocates is the standards that should be used in creating districts. For example, I am alarmed at how both parties use redistricting to eliminate competition. And so they give themselves the ability to retain a permanent majority in a legislature or in Congress, where, you know, the size of that majority might move a little bit if that party has a bad year. But the goal is to set the lines up so that even if your party's having a bad year, you still don't lose control. You might just have a smaller majority. That is very troubling to me because it eliminates responsiveness. It can eliminate accountability. So for me, if I were dictator, I would say that the primary goal of redistricting should be to create districts that are as competitive as possible, as evenly balanced as possible, to maximize competition, even if that means ugly districts, even if it means breaking cities and counties apart, because what you're doing is you're giving voters more real choice. But of course, in that, you also have to maintain minority representation to a degree.
On the other hand, as the nation struggles to become a more diverse one, ugly districts that allow groups of minorities to get a representation seem to have an attractiveness. Now, they may not appeal to the competitive aspect of things, but yet the idea of having minority groups unrepresented strikes me as offering possibilities for strife.
Oh, sure. And that's going to be a real issue. So right now, districts that are majority minority are protected under the Voting Rights Act. And in theory, under the status quo, they cannot be eliminated. They have to be preserved if possible. That's going to be a real issue because Alabama's probably going to be the poster child for this. Alabama has 7 seats in Congress. It may go down to 6. One is majority Black. It sends an African-American Democrat to Congress. It has since 1992. Every other district is safely Republican. You could eat, and that district is not pretty, but it has to be ugly to have enough African-Americans to elect a Black member of Congress from Alabama, of all places, right? That district can easily be broken apart so that every district in Alabama is majority white and super Republican. The Alabama legislature is probably going to do that. And we're probably going to see, based on some things that have been said, we're probably going to see a federal court case about whether majority minority districts have to be protected. So that's going to be an interesting area of case law. And there's also an issue where we have, in more urban areas, majority Black congressional districts that have transitioned to be majority Hispanic. You cannot, in a place like Houston, for example, districts that used to be majority Black, now majority Hispanic, you literally cannot draw a majority Black district because the populations are less segregated. So there will be some court cases around this. A lot of the court cases around this issue have been with the question of, well, how Black, how Hispanic does a district have to be in order to elect a minority? When race-based redistricting first became common, after the Jingles case in '96 and the Bush DOJ basically said to states, if you have the numbers, you have to draw the district. The standard was about 65% African-American was what was required to elect a Black member to Congress, given lower turnout rates among African-Americans. That's actually declined. Arguably now you can practically guarantee the election of an African-American with as low as a 40% Black district. And in fact, minorities, particularly minority Democrats, are getting more successful at getting elected from majority white districts. So arguably there's a less compelling rationale today to make majority minority districts as heavily minority as they used to be. But again, it's partisan, right? Democrats like to draw these districts in the 40 to 55% range. Republicans like to draw these districts as Black as possible, as Hispanic as possible. 60, 70, 80, up to even 90% we've seen in some areas, which then gets them into court. So, I mean, absolutely, there's a compelling interest to draw these districts, but there is a real political question about how segregated they need to be and should be.
I have a question. This is Melissa. Didn't Susan Wagle say late last year before she left the Senate that she planned, that her goal was to have the current legislature redraw districts to make sure that no Democrat was ever sent to Washington again?
Not using that exact phrasing, but yeah, to eliminate Sharice Davids.
Right.
She also used the example of her own state Senate district, which has been getting more Democratic. You know, Susan Wagle, she doesn't represent that district anymore, but her state Senate district in Northeast Wichita, this gives you an idea of how much suburbia is changing in America. It supported Mitt Romney by about 20 points. It went for Donald Trump by about 7, and then it voted for Joe Biden for president. You know, it has transitioned much like a lot of Johnson County has. But yet her district, even though it supported Joe Biden, elected a super conservative Republican to the state Senate. Just like a lot of legislative districts in Johnson County, they voted for Joe Biden, Sharice Davids, Barbara Bollier, but sent a super conservative to the state legislature because those voters are used to voting for Republicans locally. And also, you know, Democrats kind of surrendered on door knocking. And in that sense, you know, they ceded some campaigns, I think, to Republicans. So, you know, that Republican senator from Wichita, if she keeps the district that she has, she's going to have a competitive race every time she runs for re-election. So there's an absolute incentive to draw that district in a way that is more Republican, that's going to protect her. So yeah, Susan Wagle did say that, and
Yeah.
you know, it's going to have some consequences for our maps.
And didn't the Republicans primarize their moderate people in the primaries?
Yeah, most of the moderate Republicans in the Kansas legislature were defeated in the last primary. It was
In the last primary. And
was
so if you
close.
vote Republican, you probably,
yeah, there are not very many moderate Republicans left. I mean, it depends on the issue here and there. The moderate Republicans that are in the legislature now, they are not the moderate Republicans who I think got the most headlines from just a few years ago. You know, someone like a Melissa Rooker, or when Barbara Bollier was a Republican, like those kind of moderate Republicans are gone. In fact, they mostly represented districts that were actually Democratic districts. You know, the moderate Republicans in the legislature today are far more conservative from what a lot of their leading moderate Republicans had been. They are people who, when it comes to your social issues, you know, abortion, LGBT rights, you know, a lot of those issues, they're super conservative, but they deviate more on your tax and your education issues. So that kind of dividing line is still there, but the entire Republican caucus has really shifted to be a lot more conservative.
I had a question, and I appreciate this very much. If I've seen more about some states use independent commissions. There's a lot of AI or programs that if you put the right, like the Brennan Center has a publication of sort of what the goals might be, and all that sort of pie in the sky looking forward in terms of what the Supreme Court would do for congressional districts. But I just see, there's lots of student competitions and things like that where people are looking at this and trying to approach it in a way that we don't have this system in Congress, because the result of this is we either don't get anything done or we have the problems we have. And so I just wonder if there isn't a way or a cultural and educational change through younger people and the changing of minds to get to something where it isn't just bloodbath gerrymandering.
Well, 2 points. One, actually, the legality of redistricting commissions is probably another thing that's going to be coming up. We've seen in certain states like Arizona that use this, Republicans have started to challenge the constitutionality of this. You're starting to see some federal court action around that. We're a long way from having any resolution on that, but it is a realistic possibility that, particularly with conservatives more now uniting around this legal theory that all election actions have to originate out of a legislature. I would not rule out the possibility that redistricting commissions could be ruled unconstitutional at some point in the next decade. I mean, bluntly, for Democrats, when you lose elections, there are consequences. Do you have the ability to make people think differently about this? I mean, possibly, but the biggest trend in this is how partisan it is becoming. And when we look at, on almost any kind of political reform like this, Democrats and Republicans are increasingly diverging. Electoral college, independent redistricting. And you look at the voting patterns in Missouri around their ballot initiative around redistricting this last time. It's becoming a lot more partisan. If we look in surveys, we're not really seeing an age or an education divide. And in fact, what we're seeing oftentimes is that the most educated Democrats and Republicans are often the most hyper-partisan about it, because they know what the position of their party is, right? I mean, educated people tend to be more tuned into politics. They tend to be more likely to know what the Democratic and Republican position is. And so if there's a partisan cue, people take it, and we don't see that age is really a big divide in that. Quite frankly, if you want to change attitudes about this, it's going to sound very cynical, but playing into cynicism might be the best tactic. Playing into the idea that this really is politicians fixing their own elections, or playing into the idea that if you're a progressive Democrat, the best way you can divorce yourself from the moderate Democrats is to get rid of districts altogether, right? Move over to an electoral system like proportional representation that's actually going to encourage parties to fracture. But I don't have a really super practical.
Well, and
for you.
The other, I just think of like littering and gay marriage and things where things change. But the other question I had was on ranked voting. They do it in California. Would that impact this issue?
Well, California doesn't have ranked voting. Maine has ranked voting.
Maine.
Ranked voting, I think ranked voting is overhyped. Ranked voting is the idea that if you have multiple candidates running, you rank them rather than vote for one. And then you say that if no one gets a majority or 40% or some target, you're going to do something like eliminate the bottom candidates, reallocate their vote, or something like that, where you're taking people's second choices into account. I don't think it really has an impact on changing much in the political system. In fact, if we look at Maine, the evidence is that it actually hurts independents. Maine is one of those states like Vermont that has a bit of a history with electing independents to state legislatures. And they would often win elections by winning a third of the vote in a district where you just have to get the most votes. And so if their goal before was 30%, but then now second choice is kicking in, those independent candidates are often not able to be the second choice of voters. And so you've actually seen the legislature become a bit more partisan in that sense. I think the election where ranked choice voting might have the most impact is on something like a party primary, where you're trying to get consensus around a winner. So then you're kicking in that ranking mechanism. But I don't think it would have any real impact on polarization, on electing independents, on really making politics less partisan.
Thanks.
Do you have hi, this is Becky Plate. I was wondering, Patrick, if you have any kind of if you had to offer us one action item, if we're trying just as constituents and citizens to work on that people-powered fair maps, the less partisan, less gerrymandering, a lot of things we know, you need to contact this particular elected official or that kind of elected official. This is at a federal level, this is at a state level, this is a local level. Like if you were going to send us away with a single best case scenario action item to try to do over the next few weeks, let's say, what would you say?
I mean, I think the blunt reality is that the legislature is going to do whatever the legislature wants on this. Redistricting is probably the most partisan thing that legislatures do. And I bluntly don't believe that the average citizen, even if they organize, has a really strong probability of impacting what Topeka does. That might be a cynical take, but I think what you all want, most citizens don't really even know how this process works. And then when you do say something, you're easily ignored because their priority is to maximize seats for their party. So I wish I could tell you that there were something that you could do, but in reality, they're going to do what they're going to do. Now, long term, the legislature politicians don't like to give away their own power very much, right? I don't think they're going to enact an independent redistricting commission. If Kansas were to get something like that, it would be because ballot initiatives got instituted and voters passed it. So, I mean, advocate for the ballot initiative process. Short of that, I think if you want a check on gerrymandering in Topeka in the next session, preparing for a legal battle is probably the most realistic thing to do through the state courts in particular. So, I mean, what that legal battle looks like is going to depend on what the maps look like, and with the census data coming so late, it might not be something that's going to directly impact 2022 necessarily. Of course, there's always a role for public education in this, but I think the blunt reality is that as educated as the public, even if the public gets really educated about this, it's still going to be partisan for a lot of voters and the legislature. So I know I've given you a very disappointing answer.
Well, I'll take it away as being more about holding people accountable afterwards for what they did, be in the public sphere than trying to get them to change what they're going to do in the future.
That might work, some of them.
Anyone else have any other questions? We're actually coming right up on time. So that's fairly remarkable.
I had one quick question. What's your opinion of being able to go back and forth across party lines in primaries?
I grew up in a state that doesn't even have party registration on when you go register to vote. So by default, every primary is open because there's no way to affiliate yourself with a party in Virginia. I tend to believe in creating systems that maximize flexibility for voters. Both parties are in transition today with certain groups coming in and coming out of parties. And if people are going to float like that, create a system that lets them do it without making them have to re-register, I guess. I also understand the inverse of that. The Supreme Court has ruled that political parties are partially public entities, that in the sense that they're partially private and partially public. Public because they have an impact on politics, a huge impact on politics. But the private aspect does grant them some ability to regulate who is in their own party, which is done through party registration. So, I am sympathetic to the claim of a party that you want to make sure that it's your members participating in the party as well. So I guess I'm very ambivalent. Although I'm also at the point where I believe, our two parties as they are have somewhat become an existential threat to American democracy, and I'd love to break them both up and move to a multi-party system for a whole bunch of reasons that would probably necessitate another hot topic talk about why we have parliamentary politics in the US right now. We don't have a parliamentary system. Different topic. I'll shut up.
No, that sounds like a very interesting discussion. It does.
I'd show up for that one. So
Yeah, I would too.
thanks again so much today for your time, Patrick. This was a fabulous discussion. And I just wanted to encourage everybody to join us next month, February 18th, same date via Zoom. We're going to have Spencer Culver with Alliance for Healthy Kansas talk about Medicaid expansion. Maybe another pie in the sky, huh? I don't know. But join us.
All right, well, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Thanks. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye.
In here.
Bye.
Bye-bye.